Good evening and happy International Women's Day. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN, and I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Joann Lublin and Suzanne Muchin. Thank you for attending. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice, to name just a few. We have over 125 videos of past events archived on our website and on our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. And now for introductions. Joann Lublin was management news editor for the Wall Street Journal, working with reporters in the US and abroad until she retired in April of 2018. She remains a regular journal contributor, and she speaks about issues such as leadership and executive women. She created the journal's career advice column in 1993 and kept writing its Your Executive Career column until May of 2020. Ms. Lublin shared its Pulitzer Prize in 2003 for stories about corporate scandals. In addition to her new book, Power Moms: How Executive Mothers Navigate Work and Life, Ms. Lublin is the author of the popular 2016 book, Earning It: Hard-Won Lessons from Trailblazing Women at the Top of the Business World. Ms. Lublin won the 2018 Lifetime Achievement from the Loeb Awards, the highest accolade in business journalism. She earned a bachelor's degree in journalism with honors from Northwestern University, just a few blocks from where the FAN office, and a master's degree in communications from Stanford University. Interviewing Ms. Lublin tonight is Suzanne Muchin, who is a clinical associate professor at the Kellogg School of Management, also at Northwestern, and a guest lecturer at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. She's a co-founder of Bonfire, a new talent development accelerator for the rising generation of women in the workplace. She is a leader in Chicago's entrepreneurship community, having been part of building the brands and impact strategies for some of the city's most well-known organizations and companies, including 1871, Matter, M-Hub, and mentoring teams at Techstars, Zell Fellows, and Impact Engine. In 2012, Ms. Muchin was inducted into the Chicago Entrepreneurship Hall of Fame for her work. With her longtime business partner, she is the co-host of the popular podcast on getting better at work titled The Big Payoff. Let's now welcome Joann Lublin and Suzanne Muchin.
Thank you so much, Lonnie and Joanna. I'm excited to continue the conversation that we started on the phone together, which was great. And I will also say that you are a thank you note writer, a handwritten thank you note writer, which I still think is a lost art. And I tell all of my students at Kellogg and all of the Bonfire women that this is a must do. Do you agree?
Absolutely. And it doesn't hurt to have nice stationery to put those in.
It came right away and I loved it. And let us just all say, busy people can still write a handwritten thank you note. Power moms can still write a handwritten thank you note. So I want to start with just some table setting for our conversation today, because I think that one of these long-standing, long-lasting narratives that just won't go away is this idea that somehow executive women can have it all. And throughout our lives, yours, mine, it seems to be this running narrative that somehow with the onset of what? Technology or new theories around how we can balance work and life, that we're supposed to be able to have these fabulous careers and raise wonderful children who go off to great universities and have these wonderful marriages and look great at work and then look great walking our dogs and have clean cars and cook dinner and all the rest. And it's not even worth poking holes at that narrative because we so know that all of us here know it's not true. And so the question that we really start with is, what does having it all even mean for women? Because if it's not a goal of ours, then we have to question who's imposing that on us. I mean, has a man ever asked, how do you do it all? How do you get it all done? Never. So I thought we would start with exploring some of the themes that came out of my reading of your book and that will help all of the women listening here, moms or those who are in the workforce and putting their foot on the gas pedal, just ask some questions that I think your interviews with women who were Gen X and then also boomers. And, you know, I said, I fell right in the middle, right? I'm 1968. So you didn't interview me, which is totally fine. But all of the knowledge that you gained from that, I think will help us establish sort of a baseline for the changing conversation around executive women at work. So let's just start with this notion, because it's right there in front of us in the title of your book, around power. And I'd love to hear you talk to us about these changing notions of power. Did it mean something different to the younger women versus the boomers? And what were your observations around how that word and all that it stands for has changed over the years?
Thank you very much, Suzanne, for posing such a great and thoughtful question. And frankly, I hadn't even thought about it before you posed it. So it is a really great question because it speaks volumes as to what has changed. So remember, for this book, I interviewed 86 executive mothers. And these were women from two generations, the boomers, which is my generation, and the Gen Xers / millennials. The younger women, 2/3 were Gen Xers, 1/3 were millennials. And I think for the boomers, power meant something much different than it did and does for these younger women. And I think for the boomers, power meant actually being taken as a credible presence in the workplace. They were not seen as having earned it, a la my first book, until they demonstrated that they earned it. Whereas the next generation knew from the trails that had been blazed by that first generation that they did deserve to have autonomy, that they did deserve to accomplish great things, that they did deserve to have authority. But at the same time, I think the boomer moms interpreted power in a different way in one other respect, which is they recognized that they could exert power by paying it forward. And so many people have asked me, you know, why did 52 high-powered executive women cooperate in earning it? More than 2/3 of those women I interviewed were experienced public company CEOs. Same thing with power moms. A lot of women gave much of their time, and in both books, they had to speak on the record. And I think the underlying message there, and this is true obviously for the younger women too in power moms, is they recognize that there is power in paying it forward. And so those millennials and Gen Xers are trying to serve as role models for the even younger women who have been coming into the workplace since they joined the workplace. And at the same time, those boomer moms could exercise power by trying to be role models for their adult daughters. And that was the third piece of power moms. I interviewed 25 adult daughters of the boomers to find out what was it like growing up as Mindy Grossman's daughter. Mindy Grossman, of course, is the CEO of WW, formerly known as Weight Watchers. And this is not her first bite of the apple in terms of being a public company CEO.
So I'm going to posit then a concept that I'd like you to respond to based on what you just said, which is it would almost seem that we could break down this idea of power by talking about power over versus power to. So that to some extent, there's this notion that we, and I don't even want to go to gender and say it's a more of a male notion. I think it may be generational to say that the goal is to have power over, to have authority, to have some kind of known and seen place from which you could. While the rising generation wants the power to do something, you know, matter, have a purpose, run their lives in a particular way. And that difference in definition, I wonder if that is somehow the key to just different definitions even of success.
I think you're probably right, but I also think every generation defines success differently. If you're entering a workforce in which not only are you vastly outnumbered in terms of men in power versus women in power, of course you're going to be looking for power over rather than power to, because no one believes that you deserve to have power over. And I'm reminded of the situation I found myself in when I joined the Wall Street Journal in 1971. I was the first female reporter hired in the San Francisco Bureau on a full-time basis. Although I learned that during World War II, the secretaries in many bureaus at the Journal, who of course were all women, all got, for the most part, roped into doing some reporting tasks because there were no men, or very few men. They'd gone off to war. And so I made it real clear when I joined that bureau where my feminist tendencies were. And so when about a year or so into my tenure, I became the honorable mention winner in the local press club journalism contest, I wanted to show that I had power over a situation where I had no power. And the guys in the office all told me that because the San Francisco Press Club, like many other press clubs at the time in the early 70s, did not admit women for membership, that I should boycott the dinner as my protest. And I said, au contraire, mes frères, or as we say in French, forget it, guys, I'm not taking your advice on this one. If I don't go to the dinner and accept this honorable mention, how am I ever going to show the importance of having women as members of the press club, which, by the way, seemed like a huge mistake given that women have been journalists in our country since the Civil War. And so I wanted power over that situation. I didn't want to have the power to not go to the dinner. And so I did. And lo and behold, I'm sure it had nothing to do with my winning honorable mention, but within a few years, press clubs all over America discovered that there were female journalists.
Yeah. And so now it seems, and I love the way that you're playing with the words because it brings even more nuance to it. And so now it almost seems that we're bringing a generation to the literal and figurative table, right? So that the Gen X women and the millennial women do actually believe that they should be in the rooms where it's happening, that they deserve to be in the rooms where it's happening, but not, say that again?
Earned it.
Because that they've earned it, right? But what they're missing in my observation, and it's something that we're trying to teach at Bonfire, it's the reason that I think the course that I teach at Kellogg, Selling Yourself and Your Ideas, is so popular, is that they're missing the skills to show up and stand out and break through once they're there. And it's one of the messages that I think is really hard for some of the younger women to really absorb, which is that takes skill to be seen. You don't just get a spotlight shown on you, right? And so I'm wondering if you think that the millennial and Gen X women are aware of that set of skills is something that still needs to be learned, even though they've earned their seat at the table.
No, I don't think they have recognized that. And that's why your efforts should be hugely successful and are hugely needed. But frankly, it's what ought to be part of leadership development training inside corporate America.
Yeah.
And as we know from study after study, women are notorious for not being given frank feedback on how they're performing because, oh my gosh, their male boss is afraid they might cry. And if you don't get critical feedback on what is lacking in your skills or in your development, then you're never going to mature and you're never going to advance and you're never going to gain the recognition, frankly, that you deserve.
Absolutely. You know, I was very lucky to have had a boss and a mentor in those critical years. You know, for me, those were 27 to, 38, right? They were just those years when I had a lot of sense of self, shall we call it? Like a lot of perhaps ego around what was possible. but I had two really tough bosses. And one of them was, terrifying to me at times. But that being said, the feedback was rapid and often. I mean, do you remember, well, we both remember the fax machines, right? So that it would very slowly, the piece of paper would very slowly come off the fax machine. And I remember one of the things that happened was that I had written a letter to him, or for him, I should say, a draft of a letter that he was going to send out. And I thought it was a really good letter. And what came back over the fax machine very slowly was every time I had used the word I had been circled, and then it just scrawled across it and said, rewrite. Now, I was 28, never again. I mean, that one piece of feedback taught me more than probably 3 classes at business school, right? So I just think that there are times when we need to even teach women to ask for that kind of feedback, to be desperate for it, right? And so how do we do that? What did you learn, like from the women who are moving up? What are they doing to try to get that kind of growth mindset?
I think one of the things that they're doing is they're turning to more senior level women to be both their mentors and their sponsors.
Yes.
And because those women have been ahead of them in their careers, they understand what it is that these younger women need to know and need to learn, and can kind of show them the way. But at the same time, those senior level women can also introduce these younger women to the key change makers and status carriers who are the guys who still today in 2021 are the dominant players in our companies, big and small for the most part.
So let's talk, because I just want to make sure these terms are so important and they are different. Joann, how you define the difference between a mentor and a sponsor, because they're different.
Right. And what I used to do events in person for earning it, I was able to demonstrate this a lot better. But I would stand up and say, a mentor is someone who's going to tell me when I come up here on the stage to talk to you about earning it, and will alert me just before I step onto the stage that my flag is open. The sponsor is the person who got me the invite to be speaking to you tonight.
Absolutely. And we'll stand in the audience afterwards saying, you really should meet Joann. She's just a rock star, right? Wonderful. I want to switch us over to another notion of power over, which is our day-to-day lives, not over a human being, but this concept, which again has been so beaten to the ground about work-life balance, which I know you and I both reject. Yeah. And it's worth probably taking a moment before we turn to the phrase that I was so fascinated by that you use in the book. But it's worth, I think, taking a moment to say to people here, just briefly, why we reject work-life balance as a concept. So I will just quickly say, as a mother who's raised 5 children, now my youngest is 20, it never occurred to me that that was the goal. First of all, it didn't seem obtainable to me, but it also felt like that was the thing going to somehow make my life work. And I don't know why I knew that instinctively, but I did. And what I learned over time was that my life day to day could be really messy, but that if I stretched out the time and was able to look at it over a longer time and say, did I have quality time with my children? Was I able to actually do some things that mattered to me and my value system? Was I able to practice my Jewish faith? Things like that. That was a way of assessing whether or not my life was working much better than me looking at my calendar and going, well, how much time did I allocate? So there was something intuitive to me about the fact that this balance was a false construct. So why do you reject it?
Well, I rejected it in the course of reporting the first book, when it became real clear for the one chapter I devoted in that book to working mothers, that this was a false ideal. And it was captured in the title I used for that chapter, which was a quote from one of those 52 women. And the title of that chapter was "Manager Moms Are Not Acrobats." And it's this whole idea that how could you possibly have balance? That's like maintaining a yoga pose on balance on one leg for 24 hours. It's ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
What I didn't know is whether there was some kind of alternative. And I only discovered that when I started interviewing women from the younger wave of executive moms.
So I, saw this term in your book, and two things were happening sort of simultaneously. One was that I saw the term in your book, work-life sway, which I'm going to ask you to talk all about. And I also started listening to Kara Swisher's podcast sorry, I have to mention the New York Times. I know you're a Wall Street Journal woman, but her podcast Sway, which has the definition of, if you're in the room and you have influence, you have sway. And I think these two ideas really go together, because the word sway is such a beautiful word. It's visual, it's visceral, it's strategic. So first tell us about where did it come from? Let's start there, and then let's sort of dig into what it actually means in practical terms.
Sure, and there's no problem mentioning Kara Swisher because we're former journal colleagues.
Okay, good.
Before the time, in any case. I became so enamored when I heard about this concept that when I submitted my finished manuscript, literally a year ago this week, that was the subtitle of the book. The book was going to be called Power Moms: Secrets of Work-Life Sway from Two Generations of Executive Women.
Okay, what happened? That's a great title.
No, the publisher immediately nixed it. I don't even think she had finished reading the manuscript. She's like, no one will have any idea what you're talking about. You can't put the title. And she was right. Nobody does have any idea what you're talking about. But I was introduced to this by literally the very first younger wave executive mom that I interviewed. She's an executive at Philips, the big auction house. And the way she explained it to me is this notion is that we understand that our times we have to be 110% focused on work. And then life's going to intrude. If it's not the screaming baby because you're working from home, it's the fact that you just got this emergency call that the water heater has blown up. And so you sway to be perfectly adept and at ease with moving to the other aspects of your life, whether it's family, parenting, or just personal needs. And in her case, the way she illustrated it was that she was at work one afternoon when a text popped up on her phone, and it was a live video from her nanny showing her firstborn taking his first steps. And she was able to watch her toddler walk for the first time, which of course filled me with great envy and angst. And it made me wonder, which one of my kids actually walked in the care of the child care provider rather than in front of me. And of course, no decent child care provider would ever tell you that they had walked without you seeing it, right?
I think, it's interesting that look, your book is wonderful and the title stands, but I think there's something so visual about this idea, just like work-life balance has a visual context and you're like, no, that doesn't work.
Work-life the flow, okay?
Right? It just, to me, here's what I think it brings out. And I actually want to hear what the different generations said about this, because I think that what everyone's grappling with right now is how, especially because COVID has now created a completely different conversation about where does work take place? Can we shift our workplaces? It'll all be thrown up for grabs, so you can certainly comment on that. But I want to talk about whether women are thinking about their lives in ways that create much more fluidity between work. And it's not about, oh, I can use my phone and my computer at home. It's a mindset. It's about bandwidth. It's about saying, I can really stretch my bandwidth and focus a lot here and then snap it back and be really focused here. And the women I know who do that well, first of all, you have to practice being present that way, and your kids know it. And if you can sway like that, you really can figure this out. That's how I interpret it. So I just said a lot, but I would love for you to react to that. And also hidden inside that was the question of, how do you think the day-to-day will start to be rethought since COVID-19?
I think the day-to-day has already been greatly rethought since COVID-19. We have spent the last 12 months in an unforeseen national experiment in white-collar workers working from home. There were a very small percentage of the workers in America who had the luxury of working remotely for another company, other than people who were obviously self-employed. But the pandemic forced corporate America to engage in this, and lo and behold, it is possible to be productive and work from home if you've got a supportive employer who is understanding of the fact that you cannot be always on. You cannot be doing 12 Zoom calls a day. You have to figure out ways to allow people to determine when the work gets done, and you have to be measuring people on their results, not on the hours that are logged.
Yeah.
And so what I did last summer, when the book was already in production and there was nothing more I could do to change the content, I went back to a couple of those Gen Xer moms who were already working remotely before COVID and asked, what's different? You know, and how much did you learn from working remotely before all this happened that has made adapting to having the kids present, which was not the case for any of those women pre-COVID, that could actually help other women?
And what asks do you think women in the workplace need to make of themselves, of their colleagues, of their employers, in order to have more work-life sway? What is this from inside out, or do we need to ask for more of something?
No, I think it has to go in all three directions, okay? I think of ourselves, we need to be taking basically our mental temperatures at the end of each day and asking ourselves, what have I done nice for me today? Maybe it's even something as small as I let myself sleep in 5 minutes past the alarm going off, or I practice some kind of self-care, and I accept the notion that self-care is not selfish care, but actually self-care is promoting my mental health and reducing my stress level. From our employers, one of the things that came back from talking to those three women who were experienced at working from home or remotely before the pandemic was the fact that she had previously been at a company where the 100% of the workforce worked remotely. But once COVID happened and now her kids were under the same roof as where she was working, as was her husband, none of which was the case before, she told her employer that between 7 a.m. and 11 a.m. every day are my protected hours. I don't care if the world is on fire in terms of what's going on at the company, I am not reachable. That's the time of day that I need for me and my family and for dealing with things on the home front. And in terms of what we need to be asking from our peers, we need to make sure that our peers get feedback from us as to what we're experiencing, because the peers don't know what it is that you're going through, and they're eager to help, but they have no idea if you feel like you have to suffer in silence.
So I get asked this a lot, and I'm going to ask it of you, which is, it seems that to ask for more flexibility, for example, over your schedule, so that as a working mother, you can come in a little later so that if you want to drop off your children, you can, or work one day at home, that you have to have achieved a certain level of executive status and gravitas in order to have that kind of flexibility. And I tend to say that's not true.
I agree with you.
Okay. So can you talk about what you heard from, again, I understand you spoke to successful women, but what your research shows about who can ask for that and how do they do it?
Well, I think there's a great example in the book of a woman who comes back from maternity leave, but wants to go on a reduced schedule of a 4-day week. She has a female boss who has never had children and who basically says, no, it isn't going to happen. And so she goes out and she gets a job offer somewhere else, where she's not only able to reduce her work schedule, she can reduce it even to a greater degree than she was proposing at the last workplace, and they're going to pay her more. And she's like, I think, a professional at that point. I don't even think, she's more than a first-line supervisor, but she had proven herself as being good at her job.
Yeah.
I think that's the table stakes. It's not where you are in the pecking order, it's how good you are. I did an event a few days ago with my former bureau chief from the Wall Street Journal in Washington, Al Hunt, who's married to Judy Woodruff. And he is a character in Power Moms because he gave me a 4-day schedule with no reduction in pay after I had 2 kids under 4 years old. And in talking with him for his class of journalism students, he said to them, and this was not something he said to me at the time, I knew we had to not only give Joann what she wanted in terms of a 4-day week without a reduction in pay, because if we didn't, she was going to go get that deal somewhere else.
So that's a very fascinating theory that I want to put next to something else I heard today. So Ezra Klein has done a podcast where he was pushing back on the whole world of email and Slack and how it's not making our lives any better, any easier, or more efficient. And in one part of the podcast, he said, look, there was the era in which great workplaces were those that had the ping pong tables and the dry cleaners and the great food, in theory, so that you would stay at work all day, sleep there, right, all night, that was the status symbol. But if it's true that this next generation of talent is going to say, no, my definition of being great at work, of having a great work culture, is actually having some form of sanity over my life, then I'm actually going to go over here to this company that offers me that, not stay here where the ping pong fun is.
Exactly.
That creates a revolution. But now I'm going to say something which is a little subversive, which means as women, we would need to believe that we had, going back to power, that kind of power to do what you did and stand up and say, you know what? I'm valuable. I have that kind of currency in the marketplace. And so this offer that you're giving me on these terms doesn't work for me. And I think we need to do more to give women that kind of support and encouragement and skills.
That's right.
To have those difficult conversations.
I also think the younger generation is developing those skills, know that they have that power, because there are many, many types of places to work. And if you can't find one that meets your needs, it's easier for women to start their own businesses.
Yes.
There were a number of the younger executive moms that I interviewed who had started their own companies in
Sure.
part because they wanted to set the tone at the top. They wanted to write the unwritten rules and set a corporate culture that said, parents are welcome here. I am a parent. I know what is going on. And another thing is that it turns out we do have control over where we go next. I love this email that one of the younger executive women shared with me, where she turned down an offer to go work for a family-owned business. It was going to be her first role at the executive level. She was going to become a VP for the first time. She already had one child. She wanted to know what the maternity leave policy was at this family-owned business. And the owner said, well, we don't have one, but don't worry about it. You know, I take care of my executives. If you want to take time off for your second child and, you know, take a paid leave, I will make it happen. And this struck her as grossly unfair. She was going to get special treatment because she was an executive.
Right.
She didn't see her offers pending, but she knew her worth in the workplace, okay? And so she shared with me, and I quote in the book from her email explaining why she turned down the job.
Fascinating. So that'll take us into this last segment that I want to get to, which is the workplaces that are working for moms, empower moms, the workplaces that do look like potentially the workplace of the future. And you have a whole section on this that I found so interesting, because you do actually get very specific. Not only do you cite those companies that have policies and practices that you applaud for doing it right, but you get very specific about why it seems to be that these companies are following these practices. And what I took away from a lot of them, so you mentioned, for example, that Dow Jones has a great paid parental leave policy, or that PwC has this mentoring and community programs. I mean, they took different angles of being, you know, really great for women. But what I took from it was a lot of what's trying to be addressed by these companies was the removal of stigmas that the generation of boomers had to deal with, right? So many stigmas, and that are now trying to be addressed at the institutional policy level, so that it's not a stigma to say to your employer as you're interviewing, I'm pregnant. So that it's not a stigma to say, I'm breastfeeding. So, right, I mean, that just seemed to me something that maybe was a movement from the boomer generation to now, this attempt to just go, why does this need to be so awkward? Is that right?
No, I think you have totally hit the nail on the head, Suzanne, but not only is there the removal of the stigma, there's also the counter trend, which is we want to make it right.
Yes.
So you have less, not only less of the stigma, but you have this wholesale force of more women being in senior management, having kind of been there, done that, wanting to make it easier for the ones who are coming behind them, which is why they're paying it forward by being examples, being mentors, being sponsors. And so then the younger women feel much more entitled to get what they need and what they deserve. And so there's this great story in the book where this management consultant comes back to work after her maternity leave. And she, of course, is on the road all the time. That's what management consultants do. And she is nursing her baby. And so she has to carry 2 suitcases through the airport back from every one of her business trips, one with her clothes and one with all those bottles that she's filled with the pumped milk. And she's complaining about this to a client when she gets back at a law firm. And he's like, well, shoot, we ship the breast milk home for our lawyers when they have to be on the road and they're nursing moms. And this light bulb goes on over her head. Now, if she was in the boomer generation, she might have like quietly asked for a deal like that for herself, you know, which is what I did when I asked for the 4-day work week. I didn't ask for some universal policy for the whole news department. I asked in a really meek voice and got turned down more than once before I got this. This woman instead goes to the executive sponsor of the parenting employee resource group, the executive sponsor, of course, being a female executive who has older kids, and says, let's put this in here. This more senior woman says, let's do it as a pilot first and make sure it works before we roll it out firm-wide. And then we'll get the guys to be in support of this when they see how effective this is at reducing the stress level. So they do a pilot, the pilot works. Within a few months, they roll it out nationwide. And then they go one step further, which is what I think is so cool about so many of those great employers that I wrote about. They extend this benefit to the wives of the management consultants who work at other companies, and where they're pretty sure they don't have breast milk shipment policies.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing.
And that company, I want to toot their horn. That company is Alex Partners.
Is which, say it again?
Partners, ALIX, Alex Partners.
Wow. Wow. And that also leads me to this other sort of aha moment from looking at all of the companies and the way you talked about the policies they were implementing, was that one of the other things that was occurring was this rise of the super helpful father, right? And that was also starting to be seen as something women could be proud of. That the same way we didn't need to be sort of like quiet, like my husband's at home with the kids, right? That now we have a second gentleman. We have somebody who's been very vocal, nationally about him being here to support his fabulous, wife and the rise of her career. But that I think that our workplace policies, whether it's family leave and paternity leave, are demonstrating that there's this recognition that what we do at home and what we do at work have to have common values, that society and the workplace are just reflections of one another. And in fact, workplace culture tends to trail, like we're already ahead of that, right? So once we start to recognize that it's okay for powerful women to have their men at home, I think there's going to be a whole lot of men going, okay, like awesome, right? So I just wonder, and I'm so hopeful, my daughters are now in the workforce, one right out of college, and the other is a second grade teacher in her second year. I'm so hopeful for them. I mean, do you feel hopeful?
Absolutely. And I see it in my own grown children. My son, who I raised as a feminist, just like I raised my daughter as a feminist, has 3 children. One who's almost 3, one who's 7.5, and one who's 9.5. He was not allowed to take parental leave. They called it paternity leave back then, but it wasn't an option when the first one was born. When the 7.5-year-old was born, paternity leave, which is what it was called then, was then an option at the state agency where he worked, but no guy in his office had ever done it.
Right.
So when he took the leave, I would call him up every couple of days and say, how's it going? He'd say, well, the baby's fine, but I'm miserable because I feel like I'm missing everything at the office. And so I still dial into the staff meetings on Monday morning. I said, really? And what do you do when the infant is screaming? So I just mute my end. And by the time the third one comes along, and she'll be 3 in May, it was now parental leave, and he was totally cool with it because several other guys had done it because Dan had trailblazed.
So great. So I will tell a quick story that my youngest son, who of course has definitely heard quite a bit about the importance of respecting women and women at work. So Bonfire, as we were getting started, was creating, t-shirts and slogans and all kinds of things. So he came up with a t-shirt that has now become very, very popular that we give to men that says, brother of the sisterhood. And they love it. So they love getting it. They love wearing it. We give it out to like our customers and our investors. So
my son.
Okay, he can have one. I'll send you one, brother of the sisterhood. So my son comes up with the slogan, we make the t-shirt. He is a sophomore in college. And when I showed him how much people loved being a brother of the sister and loved the t-shirts, he says to me, am I getting a royalty on that? Like Joann, he was serious. And I said, your royalty is called, I'm in college. Or, I mean, a royalty? Like, but it was a good idea, and people do love the t-shirt. So hopefully we are going to see the rise of the brothers of the sisterhood, right? Of this rising generation of men who think it is not just cool, but empowering to see themselves as advocates. I'll tell one more quick story, which is that in our first cohort of Bonfire, we were getting women from all kinds of companies. Sometimes we'd go in through a CEO, sometimes through a chief human resource officer. One of the first companies to put women in our cohort, 5 of them at a time, at a very expensive price point, $10,000 per woman, was a company where the women were advocated by their male peer. One of the men who was in my class at Kellogg said, you know what? I think women in our company really need this. He advocated for them and brought them in, went right up the food chain. And I think this idea that we are going to get a generation of men who really find this role empowering is hopeful.
And I'd like to share a story from Power Moms that's very relevant to the point you just made, which is this woman attends her very first lunch at the company where she's just been promoted in her 30s to a vice presidency. And every other person in the room is a guy, and they're all vice presidents. And the meeting drags on and on and on, and now it's getting towards lunchtime. And one of the more senior, older VPs turns to her and says, could you go check and see why lunch is so late? And she, of course, is totally intimidated because he's much older and much higher in the food chain at this company than she is, and doesn't know what to say. Then one of her peers, a guy closer to her age, speaks up and says to this older guy, Joe, or whatever his name is, if you're so hungry, why don't you go ask? It's not her responsibility to make sure that lunch gets here.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean,
why did he speak out? Was he like, a BFF of hers? She said she hardly knew him, but she did know that he was raised by a working mom.
There you go, right? So as we're wrapping up on International Women's Day, I'm glad we've ended on a hopeful note. I think we've addressed at least the themes that for me, I found both nuanced and complicated and fresh and hopeful. There's a lot of work to be done. I'm not going to suggest that we're anywhere near where we need to be, but I will say that I think that books like yours and the conversations that you're having with women who are grappling with these ideas each and every day, this is what we mean by paving the way and trying to lift while we climb, because there's no way to do it without the conversations where women are trying to really help each other. We can't go this alone. And I think it's a uniquely female idea to try to actually ensure that the generation coming up behind us is stronger in the workplace than we are.
That's the only way we can leave a meaningful legacy, if we pay it forward.
We pay it forward. So I know that Lonnie has the questions for you that came from the audience. So
I do.
I will hand the mic to you.
Thank you. We'll just go with some of the upvotes here. So Anne Marie Eiffel asks, if women are constantly the ones asking employers for more flexibility, etc., won't we be compared to the men who are not asking for that? How do we change the script so that men and women are asking for the same things?
I think that's an excellent question, Lonnie. And the way we change the script is by setting the tone at the top. And that means that if you're the male CEO, you have to be mentoring and sponsoring women multiple levels below you and showing them what it takes to succeed by the role model that you set. If you are a female leader at the top, it means that you need to make sure that your direct reports, who are men, are also becoming role models. And so you've had situations like Jen Hyman, one of the younger power moms I interviewed, who is the co-founder and CEO of Rent the Runway, who, when she extended very generous parental leave throughout the company to hourly workers, in addition to the salaried workers, saw relatively few new fathers taking advantage of this. And so when her male chief technology officer, one of her direct reports, was about to become a dad, she more or less strong-armed him and said, you need to take your full parental leave and you need to broadcast it and make sure everyone knows that you're doing it. And lo and behold, she said after that, she couldn't think of a single new dad who wasn't taking his full leave. Men have to feel it's socially acceptable to ask for flexibility or accommodations as working dads, even once they come back from parental leave. And frankly, when it becomes more socially acceptable in the workplace for men to be looking for this, then it becomes more socially acceptable for women as well.
It seems that on that point, that even in a leadership position within a company, that it becomes incumbent upon the executive, the male executive, to, regardless really of personal preference, that to realize that they are also setting a tone. So just as it's almost like whether it's dress code or how you behave at company meetings or the various things that you do that are constantly signaling either overtly or subtly to the rest of the corporation about this is how you act at this company, that you kind of, when you're at that C-suite level, that it's even more incumbent upon the male executives to understand this and to be intentional about changing that culture. It's not really, even in some ways, even about personal preference. Do you know what I mean? It's
Absolutely.
that's sort of what it seems. So go ahead, I'm sorry.
That you set that tone at the top is by actually enforcing this notion that when you are not at work, you are not expected to be always on.
Right.
There are the CEOs, male CEOs of a few startups that enforce a rule of you will not be able to gain access to your work email while you're on vacation.
Mm-hmm.
That's what vacations are for, to be turning off.
We hosted Adam Alter a couple of years ago, he wrote a book called Irresistible. He's at NYU at their business school, and he was talking about how there was a company, I think in Germany, that had at 5 p.m., they had where it's an automatic email response. If you're trying to email any employee there, you get it's not even up to the employee, they get an automatic, sorry, it's now the weekend, basically, in short, which is kind of interesting. You actually don't even leave it to the discretion of the employee. It's just sort of like, well, it's just how our company is, which is kind of interesting as well, pretty forward thinking.
Well,
I want to get to, I'm sorry.
You cannot sleep with a heating pad on all night. It will automatically turn off or it sets your bed on fire.
That's right.
It ought to apply the same to email notifications over the weekend or on vacation. Otherwise, we are being stressed to death by being always on.
Emily here says, similar to the previous question, there's been backlash against companies that have given parents, quote, special treatment, unquote, during the pandemic from childless employees. How do we make this into something that helps all of us without alienating the childless?
I think that's a very, very astute observation. And I would point to another one of those companies that I profile at the last chapter of the book, which is American Express. And when American Express put in a much, much more generous parental leave policy that applied equally and still does to men and women alike, they knew this was going to put a burden on those who were not parents or whose children had left home to take up the slack. And so in addition to making that parental leave more generous, they gave first-line supervisors additional staffing allowances to bring in temporary extra sets of minds and hands to fill in some of those gaps. Mm-hmm. And by the same token, the point I was making earlier about a younger generation mom who created protected hours, companies ought to be offering their employees a choice to have protected hours, and it should have equal applicability across the board. It should have nothing to do with whether you're a parent.
Mhm. I want to give a quick go ahead, Suzanne.
Sorry,
Please.
Lonnie, I would only add to that I think there is a real need for not just top-down communication in those situations, but cross-team
Yes.
better communication, right? So that there isn't this elephant in the room around that topic. Because so many people have needs that don't get seen or don't get discussed. It's part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation that we need to not just make assumptions about what people need just because the childcare is so visible, right? So I just think cross teams should learn to do that better as well.
Suzanne, I appreciate that, the nuance that you added to that. I appreciate that. I want to give a quick reminder. We're at 7:57. We're going to end in just a couple minutes. We've been putting in links in the chat here to purchase a copy of Power Moms to get access to After Hours, which is going to start right around 8:05. There'll be a quick 5-minute bio break in between. Excellent opportunity to pose questions to these two brilliant women who are really trailblazers, both of them. Great opportunity. You'd probably have to spend a whole lot of cash to get any of their time otherwise. So for the low price of about $30, knock yourself out and consider yourself lucky. So please, you can find the links in After Hours, right? Or excuse me, in the chat right now. I want to go to one question, which I thought was also interesting. I know as part of the book from Sarah, she says, we are talking a lot about the notion of power and things that women have to navigate. Did Joann's research show anything regarding the impact on the children of power moms? And I'm sure, yes, go ahead.
Yes, I discovered quite a bit impact on the daughters, because that's what I was focusing on, those 25 daughters of the boomer moms who I interviewed, because I wanted to know whether they actually wanted to be just like mom, or did they want to go in a totally opposite direction because they saw how difficult it had been to be the daughter of a boomer. And in many cases, those daughters did not want to be high-level executives in a big business. They wanted to be entrepreneurs, or they wanted to be artists or musicians, or solo entrepreneurs of one kind or another in some other field far apart from where mom was. But there were nevertheless a handful who chose the same profession or ended up in the same industry, sometimes in a circuitous way. But either way that they went, many of those adult daughters of those boomer power moms discovered that mom was their secret weapon when it came to entering the workplace, because she had been there and done that. She knew how to navigate the world of work. She knew how to open doors. She knew how to connect them, and the importance of networking and the importance of it being a two-way relationship. And she also knew how to deal with office politics and very subtle forms of sexism that still pervade the workplace. And so many of those adult daughters said that their friends, their BFFs, would come to them and say, hey, could your mom look at my Instagram or LinkedIn profile, please?
Aw, that's nice. Well, Suzanne, thank you so much. What an excellent interview. You did a really great job, very thoughtful. I love that you didn't just kind of sit there and go bang, bang, chapter 1 through chapter 29. I liked it. I liked the riffing on the power moms, the word itself. I thought it was very elegant, very clever. Thank you so much for that. And Joann, a pleasure getting to know you as well.